Do you believe that reality can be scarier than any horror movie? Sometimes, stories we hear or read are so disturbing that it's hard to believe they really happened. But today, I bring you 3 true stories from 2024 that will defy logic and mess with your mind. The unknown has always fascinated us, but it also terrifies us. Whether it's the darkness of a deserted road, the secrets of an old house, or the mystery surrounding an impenetrable forest, there are places and situations that seem designed to awaken our worst fears. And these real stories are a testament to that. With each story, you'll be transported to common scenarios that quickly turn into living nightmares. The scariest part? The people involved in these stories were just going about their daily lives, never imagining that they would be the protagonists of such inexplicable and terrifying events. If you like true stories that make your heart race and defy logic, this is the video for you. And I warn you, the last story I'm about to tell you will not only send chills down your spine, but it will also leave you questioning what is truly possible in the world around us. So, turn up the volume, find a comfortable spot, and get ready to explore the darker side of reality. Stay tuned until the end, because the stories you're about to hear will prove that sometimes the truth is much scarier than any fiction. Now, let's move on to the first story, where a quiet night on a deserted road turns into a nightmare no one could have foreseen. Michael was a veteran truck driver, accustomed to long drives on isolated roads. He always said that the danger on the highways came from reckless drivers or fatigue, and never from anything supernatural. But that night, on a trip that seemed like any other, he would learn that there are things beyond human comprehension. The route was familiar, a deserted road that cut through a vast plain in the middle of nowhere. It was almost midnight when Michael began to feel the first sign of discomfort. The truck's radio, which had previously been playing a country music station, began to emit a hiss. He fiddled with the buttons, but the static persisted, leaving the interior of the vehicle in an unsettling silence, broken only by the constant sound of tires on asphalt. With a dark road stretching endlessly ahead, Michael noticed something unusual: a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated by the headlights. As the truck approached, he realized it was a woman. She was dressed in simple clothes, but something about her posture seemed out of character. She made no move to call for help, just stood there, motionless, her arms at her sides. Michael slowed down, considering stopping, but something in his instincts told him to keep going. He looked away for a second to adjust his mirrors, but when he looked back at the road, the woman had disappeared. He glanced in the rear-view mirror, but there was no sign of her, just the emptiness of the road behind him. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, perhaps because of his fatigue. However, it wasn't long before stranger things started happening. A low, whispering sound began to echo in the cabin. Michael looked around, but there was no one there. Then the radio crackled again, and for a brief moment, he heard a clear voice say, "You shouldn't be here." A shiver ran down his spine, but he kept his eyes on the road. It was as if the air around him had grown heavier. Michael decided to speed up, wanting to get this stretch of road behind him as quickly as possible. But the more he drove, the more the road seemed to repeat itself. The same signs, the same streetlights. It was as if he were stuck in an endless loop. It was then that he saw the woman's figure again, standing on the shoulder of the road, in exactly the same place as before. This time, he was sure that something was wrong. He stepped on the accelerator, trying to ignore the sight, but a loud thud resounded against the side of the truck. He almost lost control when he heard the sound, as if something heavy had hit the vehicle. Michael pulled the truck over to the shoulder, his heart racing. He got out, armed with a flashlight, to inspect the vehicle. The side was intact, with no signs of impact, but he felt like he was being watched. The night was eerily silent, without the sound of insects or wind. Then, he heard footsteps, light but close. He quickly turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to sound more confident than he actually was. No answer came, but he felt the air around him grow drastically cold. The truck door closed by itself, and he ran back inside. When he started the engine, the radio started playing again, but the music was distorted, almost unrecognizable. The words, "Get out of here," were repeated, almost like a mantra. Michael drove as fast as he could, but he felt that something invisible was following him. A presence he couldn't see, but that was impossible to ignore. Finally, in the distance, he saw the lights of a gas station. It was like a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. He stopped the truck abruptly and entered the establishment, still panting. The attendant looked at him curiously, but Michael just ordered a strong coffee, trying to calm his nerves. As he sipped his coffee, he told the attendant about the woman on the road and the strange sounds he had heard. The man, who seemed to be from the area, just nodded slowly. "You found the lady of the road," he said, his voice serious. "They say she appears to those who get too close. On the other side." Michael tried to understand what he meant, but the attendant did not elaborate, only recommending that he rest a little before continuing. Although reluctant, Michael followed the advice. He slept for a few hours in the truck, but his dreams were haunted by images of the woman, standing on the side of the road, always looking directly at him. When he woke up, he noticed that his surroundings seemed different. The sky was brighter, and the station, previously dark and empty, was now full of movement. It was as if he had crossed some kind of invisible threshold. Michael continued on his journey, but he never drove that stretch of road at night again. When Sarah and her friends decided to rent a house in a remote town for the holidays, their intention was simple: to escape the chaos of city life and enjoy some time together. There were 5 of them in total, all friends since college, and the idea of spending a weekend away from it all seemed irresistible. The house they found online was exactly what they were looking for. Nestled in a mountainous area, surrounded by dense forests and far from any neighbors, it promised privacy and a cozy atmosphere. The photos showed a rustic but charming cabin with a large fireplace and a deck that offered breathtaking panoramic views. Without thinking twice, they booked the house. From the beginning, however, something seemed off. When they arrived, they were greeted by an oppressive silence. There was no usual sound of birds or wind rustling the trees. Sarah commented that it was strange, but her friends laughed it off, saying she was being paranoid. The house was exactly as it was in the photos, but with one additional detail: an inexplicable feeling of unease. The furniture was old-fashioned, the windows creaked at the slightest movement, and the air seemed colder than it had been outside, even with the sun shining. They attributed it to the altitude and began to unpack. That first night, as everyone gathered in the living room to drink wine and play cards, something unusual happened. Sarah went to the kitchen to get more glasses when she heard footsteps upstairs. At first, she thought one of her friends had gone upstairs, but when she returned to the living room, she realized that everyone was still there. "Who's upstairs?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Her friends stared at her with confused expressions. "No one's up," said Jake, her best friend. The group decided to investigate, laughing nervously at the situation. They went upstairs together, armed with flashlights and false courage. The rooms were empty, the beds still made as when they arrived. But in the last room, they found something that shouldn't have been there: an antique rocking chair, positioned directly in front of the window. "Was this here before?" asked Megan, one of her friends. No one remembered seeing the chair, but they figured they might not have noticed. They ignored the incident and went back to the living room, where they spent the rest of the night trying to forget their discomfort. In the following days, the strange events intensified. Doors that had been closed were open in the morning. The smell of cigarette smoke filled the hallways, even though no one there smoked. At night, the sounds of footsteps and whispers echoed through the house, but they always stopped when someone tried to investigate. Sarah began to have nightmares. She always dreamed of the same figure, a tall man dressed in old clothes, who would stand at the foot of her bed, just watching. She would wake up gasping for breath, but when she turned on the light, there was no one there. However, every morning, she would find handprints in the dust that had accumulated on the glass of her bedroom window, as if someone had spent the night watching. On the second night, during dinner, the lights began to flicker. The group laughed nervously, trying to rationalize the event as an electrical failure. But the situation became more serious when the main light in the room went out completely, leaving only the dim light of the fireplace. It was then that they heard a loud sound coming from the kitchen, as if something heavy had fallen. When they went to check, they found all the cabinets open and the dishes scattered across the floor. Jake, always the skeptic of the group, tried to convince the others that it must be some animal that had entered the house, perhaps a raccoon. But the nervous expression on his face betrayed his words. Megan suggested that they all sleep in the same room, in the living room, with the fireplace lit. They agreed, but sleep did not come easily to anyone. During the night, Sarah heard whispers again, but this time they seemed to be coming from inside the room. When she looked around, she realized that all of her friends were awake, looking at each other in fear. The next morning, they decided it was time to leave, but when they started packing, they realized that something was wrong. The suitcases, which they had left next to the door, were all upstairs, in the room with the rocking chair. Jake lost his patience and shouted to the house, demanding that, whoever it was, stop it. The answer came immediately. The rocking chair began to move by itself, creaking eerily on the wooden floor. Desperate, they grabbed their things and ran out of the house. On the way back to town, no one said a word. Later, Sarah decided to research the property. She discovered that the house had belonged to a man who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. Locals believed he still inhabited the place, protecting it from intruders. Although no one in the group spoke about what had happened, Sarah knew that they were all scarred by the experience. The rental house seemed like a chance to rest, but it turned out to be something much darker, a terrifying reminder that not all places are ready to be revisited. David and his friends, Lucas and Maria, were adventurers who loved hiking and trekking in remote locations. There was something special about getting lost in nature, far from the noise of the city and the worries of everyday life. They had heard about a mystical forest, known to the locals as the Lost Forest, located in a remote mountainous area. The forest had a peculiar reputation. Those who entered it often disappeared or returned with incredible stories. This only increased the trio's curiosity. One hot summer afternoon, they decided to explore the forest. They grabbed their backpacks, strapped on their boots, and set off, not knowing what they were about to face. The trees soon closed in on them, creating a dense shadow that made the environment eerily cool, even with the heat of the sun outside. The sounds of the city were left behind, replaced by the natural sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. But as they walked further, something began to bother David. The forest seemed much denser than he remembered. The paths were increasingly winding and difficult to follow, and the trails didn't seem to connect. Every now and then, they came across ancient trees with twisted trunks that seemed to mark the edge of an unknown territory. The feeling of being watched began to set in, but he didn't know if it was fear of the forest or something deeper that made him feel this way. Lucas, on the other hand, was excited. He loved exploring places like this, and his trust in the group seemed to be rock solid. Maria was more reserved, but she let herself be carried away by Lucas's contagious energy, trying to ignore the growing feeling of unease. As they advanced deeper into the forest, the sun began to hide behind the trees, creating an even darker and more intimidating atmosphere. They decided to camp and set up a small campfire. With the flames crackling softly, they settled around the fire, talking about their lives, ignoring, or trying to ignore, the feeling that something was wrong. That was when the sound of a twig breaking came from far away, from the direction of the dense forest. "What was that?" Maria asked, her voice trembling slightly. Lucas laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Probably an animal. Relax." However, neither of them could relax completely. David felt as if he was being watched. With each snap of a twig or sigh of the wind, he looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. But nothing was there. Soon, the wind began to blow harder, causing the trees to sway strangely, as if they were moving deliberately. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch in disconnected directions, creating shapes that resembled human silhouettes, but when David looked directly at them, everything dissipated. The first strange event happened when David went to the stream to get water. He felt something, a presence, behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one. However, when he looked at his reflection in the water, he saw a figure standing behind him, someone he knew, but he was not there. He turned again, looking for Lucas and Maria, but they were still far from the fire, not noticing anything. When he returned to camp, he was more agitated than he cared to admit. They continued the night as planned, but they couldn't stop looking at each other uncomfortably. No matter how much they tried to talk, there was a tension in the air. During the night, David woke to the sound of whispering coming from the darkness. At first, he thought it was Mary or Luke, but when he looked at them, he saw that they were both fast asleep. The sound wouldn't stop. He decided to get up and investigate. As he stepped out of the tent, he felt the cold of the forest intensify. The trees around him seemed more imposing now, their dark shapes drawing patterns that David could not understand. He followed the whispers, as if something was guiding him into the unknown. As he approached an ancient oak tree, the voices intensified, now in a language he did not understand. He reached out to touch the tree, and it was at that moment that something impossible happened. A dark shadow materialized in front of him. It was an indistinct figure, human in shape, but with a face covered in darkness. David stepped back, terrified, but the figure did not move. It just watched with glowing eyes, as if waiting for something. Then, a snap of a twig brought him back to reality, and he ran back to the camp. When he arrived, Lucas and Maria were awake, their eyes wide with fear. "What happened? You were talking to someone outside," Maria said, her voice trembling. David, speechless, just shook his head, trying to explain what he had seen, but the words wouldn't come out. The presence of the figure was still very much alive in his mind, and he knew he was no longer alone in the forest. The group decided it was time to leave. The night seemed to never end, and the path back to the city seemed to be further away than before. Each step seemed more difficult, as if the ground was trying to trap them. The forest seemed to be alive, moving around them. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the feeling of relief was almost palpable, but what they didn't know was that the forest had marked them. In the following days, David, Lucas, and Maria began to notice strange things happening in their lives. Each of them had vivid dreams of the hooded figure, who always watched them, never approaching, but always present. They tried to forget what had happened, but they knew that, somehow, the forest would never let them go. They didn't talk about the incident anymore, but everyone knew that, one way or another, something had followed them. Stories like these make us reflect on how little we know about the world around us. We often take ordinary places or routines for granted, but the unexpected can surprise us in ways that defy our understanding. Each of the stories you've heard today is a reminder that sometimes danger can lurk where we least expect it. In the first story, the deserted road seemed like just another peaceful path until Michael came face to face with something that defied logic. The feeling of vulnerability in an isolated location is something many of us can relate to. How many times have we felt watched in a similar situation? The second story, about the rented house, reminds us that some memories and stories from the past can remain trapped in places, affecting those who dare to cross their path. It's disturbing to think that something as simple as a vacation can turn into an experience that changes your life forever. And then there's the forest. The vastness and mystery of natural landscapes have a unique way of inspiring both awe and fear. For Maya, curiosity led her to a place where the normal rules didn't seem to apply. How many other adventurers might have gotten lost or encountered something unexplainable in these remote places? These stories aren't just scary tales. They're reminders of the unknown forces that can be all around us. Whether they're natural phenomena, supernatural events, or just a deeply human fear of the unknown, the emotional impact of these experiences is real. As you reflect on the events you've heard, ask yourself, what would you do if you were in Michael's shoes, the friends in the rental house, or Maya in the woods? Would you be able to stay calm? Would you have the courage to revisit these places or even talk about what happened? Thank you for watching this far. If you enjoyed these stories or have a scary story to share, leave a comment below. Your story could be featured in one of the next videos. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more true and terrifying stories. Until next time, and remember, not everything that seems harmless really is.